The great observatory windows of the Karathi royal palace looked out over a sky filled with silent traffic. Cargo ships drifted like distant lanterns, their engines glowing faintly as they aligned with orbital gates, and farther away the pale rings of Kyrath shimmered in reflected starlight. From this height the empire appeared calm, orderly, eternal. Inside the palace, however, time felt strangely fragile, as if every ticking chronometer were counting down to something no one wished to name aloud. Queen Thyra sat upright on a reclining couch that adjusted constantly to support her weakening muscles, its surface shifting almost imperceptibly like the tide of a calm sea. She hated the device. It hummed too softly, like a whisper that refused to stop. More than once she had threatened to order it thrown out a window, only to discover that the engineers had thoughtfully bolted it to the floor. "You see," she said dryly to the attendant standing nearby, "even my furniture has more political influence than I do now." The attendant, a young woman with the long ears common to their kind and a face trained carefully into calm neutrality, tried not to smile. "Your Majesty still governs the empire." "From a chair that refuses to let me stand," Thyra replied. "A very inspiring image for the people." The truth, though unspoken, hung heavily in the chamber. The physicians had already delivered their final consensus. The degeneration spreading through her nervous system was irreversible. Weeks, perhaps a little more, if fortune proved unusually generous. The court had begun quiet preparations, sealed discussions, discreet movements of officials, the drafting of speeches that spoke of continuity and stability while carefully avoiding the word death. Thyra was not afraid of dying. What troubled her was the unfinished work, the reforms still fragile, the fragile peace between neighboring systems that might fracture the moment her authority vanished. Empires, she reflected, were like delicate crystal sculptures, magnificent but always one careless vibration away from shattering. A soft chime sounded, and the chamber doors parted to admit three of her senior physicians. Their robes glimmered faintly with embedded diagnostic threads, and their expressions carried the solemn gravity of those who believed themselves custodians of absolute truth. They spoke at length, presenting updated projections, biochemical analyses, and predictive models rendered in floating diagrams that rotated slowly in the air. Thyra listened patiently, though she had already heard it all before. The disease progressed, the treatments failed, the probabilities narrowed. When they finished, one of them added gently, "Your Majesty should conserve her strength." Thyra inclined her head. "I assure you, Doctor, I am conserving it with remarkable dedication. I have even reduced the number of arguments I win each day." One of the physicians, unable to suppress it, let out a brief startled laugh before catching himself. The others looked faintly scandalized, which only amused Thyra further. After they departed, silence returned, broken only by the distant murmur of the palace's environmental systems and the faint rustle of the wind against the high terraces. Far across the palace complex, in a wing devoted to diplomatic research, a human named Owen Harlan leaned over a projection table covered in medical schematics. He had arrived on Karath 3 days earlier, summoned to advise on disease control protocols for long-range trade fleets. The assignment was straightforward, almost routine, though the sheer scale of Karathi infrastructure fascinated him. Their diagnostic systems alone were decades ahead of most human colonies, and he found himself lingering in archives simply to admire the elegance of their data structures. He stretched, rubbing his eyes, and muttered to himself, "If I stare at one more protein chain, I'm going to start naming them." A Karathi technician working nearby glanced over. "Naming them?" "Yes," Owen said solemnly. "I was thinking of calling this one Gerald. It looks like a Gerald." The technician blinked, uncertain whether this was humor or madness, then decided it was safer not to ask. Owen returned to his work, scrolling through archived case files to compare neurological patterns. One record caught his attention, not because of the name attached to it, which he noticed only a moment later, but because of the biochemical markers. They were disturbingly familiar. He leaned closer, zooming in on the data. The degradation pathways, the inflammatory cascades, the structural collapse of neural support tissues. It resembled a syndrome he had studied years ago in a remote human population exposed to an unusual environmental toxin. His eyes flicked to the patient identification. Thyra Ellereth, sovereign of Kirath. Owen sat back slowly. Well, he murmured, that's inconvenient. He read deeper into the file, his curiosity sharpening into focus. The Karathi physicians had classified the condition as a rare genetic degeneration unique to their species. But the pattern suggested something else, something convergent, a shared vulnerability buried in the deep architecture of living cells across species. He frowned, tapping a sequence of commands to isolate specific markers. The resemblance was not perfect, but it was close. Close enough to raise a question that refused to leave his mind. What if it wasn't incurable? Hours passed without him noticing. The lights in the laboratory shifted gradually to simulate evening, and the distant hum of activity faded as most of the staff departed. Owen remained at the projection table, surrounded by drifting columns of data, running simulations, adjusting variables, chasing the fragile thread of a possibility that seemed almost absurd. At one point he leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and said aloud, "All right, either I'm completely wrong, or everyone else is." The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it filled him with a quiet, restless determination. Outside, night settled over the palace. In her chamber, Queen Thyra watched the stars emerge one by one, their cold light reflecting in her eyes. She wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to be surprised again, not by politics or diplomacy, but by something truly unexpected. She did not yet know that, in another wing of the palace, a human researcher was staring at her medical file with growing certainty that the end of her life might not be the end after all. Owen did not sleep that night. The laboratory windows slowly shifted from the deep violet of artificial night to the pale blue of simulated dawn, but he barely noticed. Lines of data scrolled past his eyes, charts reassembled themselves in layers of translucent light, and every time he thought he had reached the end of the analysis, another question appeared, tugging at him like a loose thread. The pattern remained stubbornly consistent. It could not be coincidence. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "All right," he said quietly. "Either I'm about to embarrass myself in front of an entire Royal Medical Council, or I'm about to interrupt a funeral." Neither possibility felt particularly comfortable. A cleaning drone floated past, paused, and rotated slightly as if studying him. Its small optical sensor glowed softly. "You look tired," the drone said in a neutral tone. Owen blinked. "I'm sorry. Did the cleaning drone just diagnose me?" "I am programmed to detect organic fatigue indicators," it replied calmly. "You should rest." "I will," Owen said, "as soon as I solve a cross-species neurodegenerative disorder." The drone paused, then drifted away without comment, perhaps deciding this was above its jurisdiction. By mid-morning, Owen had prepared a preliminary model, tentative, incomplete, but coherent enough to present. The underlying mechanism of the Queen's illness appeared to involve a cascade failure in cellular repair proteins. The Karathi researchers had focused on stabilizing the damaged structures, but in human cases the key had been stimulating an alternate metabolic pathway, effectively bypassing the failure entirely. It was not a cure, not exactly. More like building a bridge while the original road collapsed. He hesitated only briefly before submitting a request for access to the Royal Medical Archives at a higher clearance level. The authorization took longer than expected, which was never a good sign. It usually meant someone important was asking questions about why a visiting human researcher was suddenly interested in the Queen's condition. Late that afternoon, two Karathi physicians arrived at the laboratory. They introduced themselves with impeccable courtesy, but their expressions were guarded. "We understand," said the older of the two, "that you have been reviewing the medical records of Her Majesty." "Yes," Owen said evenly. "I believe I've identified a treatment pathway worth investigating." The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. Finally, the younger physician folded his hands behind his back. "You believe," he repeated carefully, "that you have found what our entire medical establishment has overlooked." "When you say it like that," Owen said, "it sounds arrogant. I prefer to think of it as statistically improbable." Neither physician smiled. Owen activated the projection table, bringing up his models. He explained the parallels he had observed, the similarities in protein behavior, the theoretical mechanism of intervention. As he spoke, the physician's skepticism shifted, not disappearing, but sharpening into focused attention. "You are proposing," the older physician said slowly, "to apply a treatment derived from human metabolic research to Karathi neural tissue." "Yes. That is unprecedented." Owen nodded. "So was treating infections with mold cultures once. Science has a habit of sounding ridiculous right up until it works." The younger physician exchanged a glance with his colleague. "Even if your theory were correct," he said, "adapting the protocol would require extensive modification. The biochemical differences alone—" "I know," Owen said. "It would take time and precision, but it's possible." Another silence settled, heavier than before. At last the older physician said, "Her Majesty has weeks to live, perhaps less. Experimental treatment could accelerate the degeneration." Owen met his gaze. "Or it could stop it." The physicians departed soon after, taking copies of his analysis. Owen watched them go, uncertain whether he had just opened a door or slammed it shut. That evening, in a private chamber deep within the palace, Queen Thyra listened as her medical council summarized the proposal. "A human researcher," one of them concluded, "believes he may have identified a treatment pathway." Thyra raised an eyebrow. "Believes?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "And what do you believe?" The physicians hesitated. Finally, one said, "We believe the probability of success is extremely low." "Extremely low," Thyra repeated thoughtfully, "as opposed to the probability of my survival without it." No one answered. She leaned back, studying their faces. For all their brilliance, they looked tired, burdened not only by the limits of their knowledge but by the weight of admitting those limits existed. "Bring him to me," she said. The council exchanged glances. "Your Majesty—" "I did not ask whether you approved," Thyra said gently. "I asked to meet the man." The audience was arranged the following morning in a smaller reception hall, less formal than the throne chamber, but no less imposing. Owen stood waiting, trying very hard not to stare at the vaulted ceiling or the silent guards or the enormous window overlooking the city. When Thyra entered, supported lightly by an attendant, but walking under her own strength, he felt an unexpected jolt of respect. She looked frail, yes, but there was nothing fragile in her gaze. Her long ears angled slightly forward, an expression he would later learn signaled curiosity. "You are the human who wishes to prevent my untimely demise," she said. Owen inclined his head. "I would settle for postponing it, Your Majesty." A faint smile touched her lips. "An honest answer. That is refreshing." They spoke for nearly an hour. Owen explained his theory as clearly as he could, avoiding technical jargon when possible. Thyra asked precise, intelligent questions, occasionally surprising him with insights that showed she understood more of the science than most rulers ever bothered to learn. At one point she asked, "If I were not a queen, would you still recommend this treatment?" Owen considered the question carefully. "Yes. Even if I were, how do humans say it, a difficult patient?" "I've treated several of those," Owen said. "Some of them were even human." That earned a quiet laugh from Thyra, and the tension in the room eased slightly. At last she fell silent, gazing out the window at the distant skyline. "If I refuse," she said softly, "I will die within weeks. If I accept, I may die sooner, or live longer than anyone expects." "Yes," Owen said. She turned back to him, and there was something steady and unafraid in her expression. "Then we will try," she said. The physicians protested, of course. There were protocols, ethical reviews, risk assessments. Thyra listened patiently, then said, "I appreciate your concern, but I believe I am still permitted to decide whether to remain alive." That ended the debate. As Owen left the chamber, his mind already racing with calculations and preparations, Thyra watched him go. For the first time in many weeks, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Not certainty, not even hope, but possibility. The laboratory assigned to the treatment effort had once been used for advanced bioengineering research, and it showed. The ceilings were high, the air carried a faint, sterile scent of ionized filtration. An entire wall shifted into display surfaces at a spoken command. Transparent cylinders held nutrient mediums, glowing faintly with internal light, and articulated surgical drones rested in charging alcoves like mechanical birds waiting for flight. Owen stood in the center of it all, staring at a molecular model rotating slowly in midair. This, he said quietly, is either going to save her or make me the most infamous researcher in 2 galaxies. A Karathi technician nearby tilted her head. Infamous? Very famous, Owen clarified, but for all the wrong reasons. She considered this. That seems inefficient. Owen chuckled softly. You have no idea. The adaptation process proved more complicated than even he had expected. Karathi's cellular metabolism functioned in overlapping biochemical cycles, rather than the linear cascades common in humans. Enzymes behaved differently, signaling proteins activated in patterns that sometimes resembled musical rhythms more than chemical reactions. Several times Owen found himself staring at the data with the uneasy feeling that the body he was trying to treat operated according to rules only partially understood by anyone. The physicians assigned to assist him watched closely. Some were openly skeptical, others cautiously curious, but none interfered. They asked sharp questions, challenged assumptions, and occasionally argued among themselves in rapid Karathi that sounded almost like singing. One evening, after 12 hours of continuous work, Owen leaned against a console and rubbed his eyes. A physician named Relin approached, glancing at the latest projections. You have not rested. I tried, Owen said. My brain refused to cooperate. Relin studied him. Humans are inefficient organisms. You require excessive sleep. True, Owen said, but we compensate by inventing coffee. Relin frowned. Coffee? A beverage. Bitter, slightly acidic, capable of restoring consciousness to the nearly dead. Relin blinked. You are certain it is not classified as a medical device? Some mornings I am. Despite the tension, moments like this began to ease the atmosphere in the laboratory. The work remained serious, but the quiet exchanges, small jokes, shared observations, created a fragile sense of camaraderie. After 3 days, the first viable treatment sequence was ready for testing in controlled tissue cultures. Owen watched the results appear in real time, heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. At first, nothing happened. Then the degradation markers stabilized. Then slowly, the repair pathways began to activate. Relin leaned closer to the display, his long ears tilting forward in disbelief. That should not be possible. Owen exhaled slowly. I prefer to think of it as statistically surprising. The transition from laboratory success to clinical application, however, was far more daunting. The treatment required a precisely timed sequence of biochemical infusions, neural stimulation patterns, and metabolic adjustments. Even a minor error could cause catastrophic failure. On the morning of the first procedure, the atmosphere in the medical wing felt heavy, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Queen Thyra lay on a diagnostic platform surrounded by softly glowing instruments. She looked pale but composed, her gaze steady as Owen approached. You appear troubled, she said. I'm trying very hard not to be, Owen admitted. That is encouraging, Thyra replied. I would be concerned if my physician looked cheerful at a moment like this. He allowed himself a faint smile. I'll try to look moderately anxious instead. That seems appropriate. The physicians moved with quiet precision, preparing the infusion systems, calibrating neural interfaces, verifying every parameter again and again. The treatment began with a sequence so gentle it seemed almost insignificant, a controlled introduction of catalytic compounds designed to trigger the alternate repair pathway. Minutes passed. The monitors showed no immediate change. Then gradually the cellular stress indicators began to decline. A murmur spread through the observation room. One of the senior physicians leaned closer to the display, as if proximity alone might reveal an error in the readings. Owen remained very still, watching the data scroll. Stabilization was only the first step. Improvement, if it came at all, would take time. The procedure lasted nearly 4 hours. When it was finished, Thyra was exhausted but conscious. Well, she said faintly, I am still alive. That's generally considered a positive outcome, Owen said. I should hope so, she replied. I would hate for this to be remembered as a very elaborate method of proving my physicians correct. Despite the tension, several of them smiled. The following days were the longest Owen could remember. Every hour brought new data, new scans, new analyses. At first, the disease progression simply slowed. That alone was enough to cause cautious optimism, though no one dared to say it aloud. Then on the fifth day, a technician reviewing neural imaging froze, staring at the display. Doctor, she said quietly, you should see this. Owen stepped beside her. The regeneration markers, faint but unmistakable, had begun to appear. For a moment he said nothing. Then he sat down heavily in the nearest chair and let out a breath he felt he had been holding for a week. Relin, standing behind him, said softly, "It is working." Owen nodded. "Yes, I think it is." News of the improvement spread quickly, though officially nothing was announced. In the palace corridors, whispers replaced the quiet certainty of morning. Servants began to speak of the queen's recovery in cautious, almost superstitious tones, as though saying it too loudly might cause the miracle to vanish. In her chamber, Thyra felt the change before the instruments confirmed it. The constant ache that had filled her body for months began to recede, replaced by a faint, unfamiliar sensation. Energy. One afternoon, she rose from her couch without assistance and walked 3 steps before realizing what she had done. She laughed aloud, a clear, bright sound that startled the attendants. "It appears," she said, steadying herself on the edge of a table, "that I may need to cancel my funeral after all." Far across the medical wing, Owen stood at a window overlooking the city, watching ships drift through the evening sky. For the first time since arriving on Kirith, he allowed himself to feel something close to hope. Not the fragile, uncertain kind, but the steady, growing certainty that sometimes the impossible was only the unfamiliar waiting to be understood. The improvement did not come like a sudden storm. It arrived the way dawn does, quietly, almost invisibly, until the darkness realized it had already begun to retreat. 3 days after the first signs of regeneration, Queen Thyra was able to walk the length of her chamber without assistance. The physicians monitored every step as if she were crossing the surface of an unstable moon. Sensors tracked her neural responses, muscle activity, metabolic shifts, and a dozen other variables that scrolled across hovering displays in neat columns of data. Thyra reached the far window, rested one hand lightly against the cool glass, and looked out over the city. The morning sunlight painted the towers in bands of gold and pale blue, and for a moment she simply stood there, breathing, feeling the quiet strength in her body. Behind her, one of the physicians whispered, almost reverently, "The degeneration markers continue to reverse." Another replied, "At this rate..." He did not finish the sentence. None of them quite trusted the words yet. Thyra turned, catching their expressions. "You may speak freely," she said gently. "I promise not to collapse dramatically in protest." A ripple of subdued laughter passed through the room, breaking the tension. Later that day, Owen joined the physicians in reviewing the latest data. He leaned over the projection table, studying the cellular repair curves. "It's stabilizing faster than I predicted," he said. "The secondary pathways are reinforcing the primary repair cycle. I thought that would take weeks." Relin folded his arms, his expression thoughtful. "Your treatment did not merely interrupt the disease. It appears to have rebalanced several metabolic systems simultaneously." Owen raised an eyebrow. "I wish I could claim that was intentional." Relin regarded him for a moment. "You are an unusual scientist." "I've been told that before," Owen said, "usually by people who meant it as an insult." Relin's ears tilted slightly in what Owen had come to recognize as amusement. The laboratory atmosphere began to change as the days passed. Where there had once been cautious silence, there was now quiet energy. Conversations that lasted longer, debates that grew livelier, occasional bursts of laughter that echoed faintly off the high ceilings. The work remained intense, but the sense of impending tragedy had lifted, replaced by something far rarer: anticipation. One afternoon, while recalibrating a diagnostic array, Owen found himself staring at a display of neural activity patterns that resembled flowing currents of light. "You know," he said to the technician beside him, "if I ever retire, I might frame one of these images and hang it on a wall." "As decoration?" she asked. Yes, it's beautiful. She considered the shifting patterns. It does resemble abstract art. Exactly, Owen said. Very expensive abstract art, given how much equipment it took to produce. Meanwhile, throughout the palace, the change in the queen's condition became impossible to conceal. Servants who had grown accustomed to walking softly now spoke in normal voices again. The kitchens resumed their full activity, filling the corridors with the scent of spiced grain and roasted vegetables. Even the palace garden seemed brighter, though no one could have explained why. Thyra began spending part of each day in the gardens, walking slowly along the stone paths. The first time Owen joined her there, he noticed how different she looked, not merely healthier, but more alive in a way that was difficult to define. Her movements were steadier, her voice stronger, and her eyes held a quiet, reflective light. I had forgotten, she said, watching a flock of silver-winged birds wheel above the trees, how much time there is in a single day when one is not counting how many remain. Owen nodded. Time expands when you stop measuring it. She glanced at him. That sounds like something a philosopher would say. I studied medicine, Owen replied, but I read philosophy when the textbooks became unbearable. And did it help? Sometimes, he said. Other times it just gave me more complicated questions. She smiled faintly. Those are often the best kind. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of water from a nearby fountain mingling with the distant hum of traffic in the sky above the city. At last, Thyra said, You have changed more than my condition, you know. Owen looked at her. How so? My physicians have begun arguing with one another again, she said. Not about what cannot be done, but about what might be possible. I had almost forgotten what that sounded like. He smiled. Healthy disagreement is a sign of progress. Or chaos, she said lightly. Those two things are often related. A few days later, Thyra insisted on attending a small council session. The ministers, who had prepared themselves for months to conduct their work without her, were visibly startled when she entered the chamber on her own, moving slowly but without assistance. One of them rose so abruptly that his chair tipped over with a loud clatter. I see, Thyra said calmly, taking her seat, that my continued existence remains a source of administrative disruption. The tension in the room dissolved into relieved laughter, and for the first time in many weeks the council meeting proceeded as it once had. Voices raised in debate, arguments sharpened by wit, the quiet rhythm of governance restored. That evening, Owen stood once more at the laboratory window, watching the lights of the city flicker on one by one. The sense of relief he felt was deeper than he had expected, edged with a quiet exhaustion that settled into his bones. Relin joined him, holding two small cups filled with a steaming Karathi beverage. You require coffee, Relin said, handing him one, but this is the closest equivalent available. Owen took a cautious sip, then raised an eyebrow. This tastes like someone tried to brew tree bark. Relin considered this. Is that unfavorable? I'm not sure yet, Owen admitted, taking another sip. It might grow on me, like most things that are good for you. They stood in silence for a while, watching the slow movement of ships against the stars. At the beginning, Relin said quietly, I believed your treatment was an act of desperation. Owen nodded. So did I, a little. Relin looked out at the sky. Now I believe it may be the beginning of something else. Owen followed his gaze, watching the lights of a distant vessel as it slipped into orbit. Yes, he said softly. I think it might be. The palace no longer moved in whispers. Voices returned to the corridors, footsteps regained their natural rhythm, and the great halls, once heavy with expectation of morning, filled again with ordinary conversation. Yet beneath the renewed activity, there lingered a sense of disbelief, as if everyone were waiting for the universe to correct what seemed like an error in its calculations. Queen Thyra stood on a high terrace overlooking the capital, the wind moving gently through her hair and along the edges of her long ears. The air carried the distant sounds of the city, transport craft gliding between towers, vendors calling in the lower districts, the faint hum of orbital traffic above the atmosphere. Owen joined her quietly, pausing a respectful distance away. You are walking farther each day, he said. Yes, Thyra replied, though I am beginning to suspect that the palace floors have grown longer out of spite. That's possible, Owen said, Architecture is known for its subtle revenge. She laughed softly, and the sound carried lightly in the open air. Her recovery had accelerated beyond what even Owen's most optimistic projections had predicted. The disease was not merely halted. In many areas, the damage had begun to reverse. Neural pathways reformed, muscle strength returned, and the persistent fatigue that had once shadowed every movement had faded into memory. The physicians now studied her condition with a mixture of fascination and humility. Entire teams worked around the clock, analyzing the treatment protocols, mapping every stage of the recovery, and debating what it meant for the future of medicine. One afternoon in the central laboratory, a heated discussion broke out between two senior researchers over the interpretation of a regeneration curve. It is not merely repair, one insisted. The tissue architecture is reorganizing itself more efficiently than before. That is impossible, the other replied. Biology does not improve itself without selective pressure over generations. Owen, passing by, glanced at the display and said, "Perhaps surviving something that was supposed to be fatal counts as selective pressure?" The two researchers fell silent, considering this. A moment later, one of them said, "I dislike it when the human is correct." "That's fair," Owen said. "I dislike it when I'm wrong. So we're even." The debate resumed, though now with a tone of reluctant amusement. Meanwhile, the news of Thyra's recovery began to spread beyond the palace, carried by diplomatic channels and commercial networks. Reports were cautious at first, then increasingly confident. Across neighboring systems, scholars and physicians reacted with astonishment. Messages arrived daily, requests for data, invitations to collaborate, expressions of disbelief so eloquent they bordered on poetry. Owen found himself summoned to meetings he had never expected to attend, standing before assemblies of officials who regarded him with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. At one such meeting, a minister said, "You have altered the course of our history." Owen shifted uncomfortably. "I adjusted a treatment protocol." "Yes," the minister replied, "but sometimes history turns on smaller adjustments than we imagine." The attention unsettled him more than he admitted. He preferred laboratories to ceremonial halls, data to speeches, the quiet logic of science to the unpredictable currents of politics. One evening, seeking a moment of solitude, he wandered into the palace gardens and found Thyra seated beside a reflecting pool, watching the slow movement of luminous aquatic plants drifting beneath the surface. "You look as though you are trying to escape," she said without turning. "Is it that obvious?" To someone who has spent her life observing people. "Yes." He sat beside her. For a while they simply watched the water, the faint ripples catching the light of the evening sky. "I am not accustomed to being celebrated," Owen said at last. "In my experience, most research goes unnoticed unless it fails." Thyra nodded. "Leadership is similar. If everything functions well, no one notices. If one thing fails, everyone notices." "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she said, then added lightly, "but it has its moments." They sat in silence again, comfortable in the quiet. After a time, Thyra said, "When I believed I was dying, I found myself thinking often about what would remain after me. Policies, treaties, monuments, all the things rulers imagine will outlast them. Now I wonder if the most important legacy is not what we build, but what we change in one another." Owen considered this. "That sounds like philosophy again." "I am learning from the best," she replied. A faint smile touched his face. In the weeks that followed, Thyra's strength returned almost completely. She resumed attending council sessions regularly, walking through the palace without assistance, even visiting the medical wing to observe the ongoing research into cross-species treatments. During one such visit, she paused beside a group of technicians studying a complex molecular simulation. "Will this work on other conditions as well?" she asked. One of the researchers hesitated. "We do not yet know, Your Majesty." Thyra nodded thoughtfully. "Then it seems we have much to learn." As she moved on, Owen watched her with quiet reflection. The transformation was not only physical. There was a new depth to her presence, a calm certainty shaped by the knowledge of how close she had come to losing everything. Later that night, standing once more at the laboratory window, Owen looked out at the stars and felt an unfamiliar sense of belonging. Kirith no longer felt like a distant world. It felt, in some small but undeniable way, like home. Behind him, the laboratory hummed softly, filled with researchers of two species working side by side, arguing over data, exchanging ideas, laughing occasionally at jokes that needed no translation. And as the lights of the city shimmered below, it became clear that something far greater than a single life had been saved. A barrier had been crossed, quietly but irrevocably, and the future, vast and uncertain, seemed wider than it had ever been before. The first time Queen Thyra returned to the Hall of Assembly in full ceremony, the entire chamber fell silent before she even reached the central platform. It was not the ceremonial robes or the crown that drew their attention. It was the simple, undeniable fact that she walked without assistance, her steps steady, her posture strong, her presence once again filling the vast space as it had in years past. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then one of the oldest ministers, who had served 3 rulers before her, bowed deeply and said, "It is good to see the future return, Your Majesty." Thyra inclined her head. "I had no intention of abandoning it." A quiet ripple of relieved laughter moved through the chamber, easing the tension that had lingered there for months. The work of governance resumed quickly. Trade negotiations, infrastructure debates, diplomatic messages from distant systems. Everything that had been suspended or delayed now demanded attention at once. Thyra found herself working long hours, yet the fatigue that followed was the ordinary tiredness of effort, not the crushing exhaustion she had once known. During a recess in the council session, she stepped onto a balcony overlooking the inner gardens. Owen stood there already, leaning on the railing and watching a small transport craft glide silently between towers. "I'm beginning to think," he said without turning, "that governments everywhere operate on the same principle." "And what principle is that?" Thyra asked. "They save all the complicated decisions for the exact moment when everyone is most tired." "That," Thyra said dryly, "is not a principle. It is a tradition." They stood side by side for a while, the warm afternoon air carrying the faint scent of flowering trees. "You seem more at ease," Thyra said after a moment. "I am," Owen admitted. "At first I kept expecting something to go wrong, a complication, a reversal. But the data has been stable for weeks now." "And you trust the data?" "I trust the data," he said. "It's people I worry about." She raised an eyebrow. "You find people less predictable than biology?" "Much less." She laughed softly, and the sound echoed faintly off the stone walls. Meanwhile, in the research wing, the laboratories had become busier than ever. Teams of Karathi and human scientists worked together to refine the treatment protocols, adapting them for other conditions and testing variations in controlled environments. Entire new departments had been established almost overnight, their corridors filled with equipment still smelling faintly of fresh fabrication. Relayan stood in one of the new laboratories, studying a projection of a cellular repair sequence when Owen entered. "You have started a revolution," Relan said without looking up. "I adjusted a treatment," Owen replied automatically. Relan turned to him. "Yes, and the difference between those two things is smaller than you believe." Owen glanced at the projection. "How are the trials progressing?" "Promising," Relan said. "We have already identified 3 other degenerative syndromes that may respond to similar approaches." Owen exhaled softly. "That's remarkable." Relan studied him. "You are surprised." "I hoped," Owen said, "but hoping and seeing are different things." A group of younger researchers nearby were arguing over a calibration error. One of them said in frustration, "This algorithm makes no sense." Another replied, "It makes perfect sense if you stop assuming human mathematical conventions." Owen raised an eyebrow. "I feel personally attacked." The researchers laughed and the tension dissolved into renewed concentration. Later that evening, Thyra visited the laboratory unannounced. The researchers, startled at first, quickly resumed their work when she waved away formalities. She moved slowly through the room, observing the displays, the instruments, the quiet intensity of collaboration. For a moment, she simply watched Owen and Relan discussing a set of molecular models, their conversation animated, their gestures almost identical despite the differences in their species. "It is strange," she said at last, "to see ideas moving faster than politics." Owen looked up. "Ideas usually do." "And yet," she said thoughtfully, It is politics that decides whether those ideas are allowed to live. Relin inclined his head. Then perhaps this time politics will learn to keep pace. Thyra smiled faintly. That would be a historic achievement. As she prepared to leave, one of the youngest technicians approached her hesitantly. "Your Majesty," the technician said, "may I ask a question?" "Of course." "What did it feel like?" the technician asked quietly. "To know you were dying, and then to realize you were not." Thyra considered this for a moment. "It felt," she said slowly, "like standing on the edge of a vast darkness and discovering that the ground behind you is still there. You do not step forward with the same certainty afterward, but you also do not take a single step for granted." The technician nodded, thoughtful. That night the palace terraces were quiet, the sky clear and filled with stars. Owen stood alone for a while, watching the slow movement of a distant orbital station, its lights drifting like a constellation of their own. Footsteps approached, and Thyra joined him. "You are thinking again," she said. "I do that occasionally," he replied. "And what occupies your thoughts tonight?" He hesitated, then said, "I was wondering what happens next." She looked up at the stars. "Next," she said softly, "we learn how to use what we have discovered. Carefully, patiently, together." Owen nodded, and for a while they stood in silence, watching the slow, endless motion of the universe above them, both aware that the future no longer felt uncertain in the same way. It felt open. The day Queen Thyra addressed the Assembly of Systems, the Great Hall was filled beyond capacity. Delegates from neighboring worlds had arrived in person or by holographic relay. Scholars occupied entire balconies, and the press galleries buzzed with quiet anticipation. Months earlier, many of these same people had prepared statements of mourning. Now they waited to witness something else entirely. Thyra stood at the center of the chamber, the light of the vaulted ceiling reflecting softly in her eyes. She no longer carried any visible trace of illness. Her posture was steady, her voice clear, and there was a calm assurance in her presence that had deepened rather than diminished through her ordeal. "For generations," she began, "we believed that knowledge must be guarded, that the boundaries between our peoples were necessary to preserve what made us unique. But I stand before you alive today because those boundaries were crossed." A quiet murmur passed through the hall. "A human scientist," she continued, "saw what we could not see, not because he was wiser than us, but because he was different from us. And that difference, once feared, became the very thing that saved my life." Owen, standing among the observers, shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. But he could not deny the truth of her words. Thyra went on to announce the creation of a new interspecies institute dedicated to collaborative medicine and research. Laboratories would be built not only on Kyrath, but on several allied worlds. Data would be shared openly, and scholars of different species would work together as equals. "This," as she said, "will be my legacy, not monuments or decrees, but a door that will never again be closed." The chamber erupted in applause that echoed for several long moments. In the weeks that followed, the work began immediately. Construction drones filled the skies above the research district, assembling new facilities in elegant geometric patterns. Scientists arrived from distant systems, bringing unfamiliar instruments and stranger ideas. Languages blended in the corridors, and arguments over methodology became so frequent that the sound of debate itself became a kind of music. Owen found himself at the center of it all, though he tried repeatedly to avoid the role. Invitations to lecture arrived daily, and students followed him through the laboratories, asking questions so rapidly that he sometimes forgot what he had originally been doing. One afternoon, after explaining the same metabolic pathway for the fourth time in an hour, he leaned against a console and said, "I used to think research was quiet." A young Karathi student replied, "It is quiet. This is what happens after research." Owen considered this and laughed. "Fair enough." Rillen approached, holding a tablet filled with new trial data. "You will want to see this," he said. The projections showed successful treatments of 2 additional degenerative conditions, each adapted from the original protocol. The results were not perfect, but they were promising, enough to confirm that the breakthrough had not been a singular miracle, but the beginning of a new understanding. Owen studied the data, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. "We're only at the beginning," he said. "Yes," Relin agreed, "and beginnings are rare things." Meanwhile, Thyra found that ruling after surviving death felt different from ruling before it. She listened more carefully, spoke more deliberately, and spent more time walking among her people rather than observing them from a distance. The experience had stripped away certain illusions. The belief that power alone could shape the future. The assumption that strength meant certainty. One evening, she walked through the gardens with Owen, the air cool and fragrant with night-blooming flowers. The sky above was filled with stars, and a long line of cargo vessels moved slowly across the horizon like a procession of silent lanterns. "You have changed," Owen said quietly. "So have you," she replied. "I'm still the same person." "No," Thyra said gently. "Before, you were a scientist searching for answers. Now you are someone who knows that answers can change worlds." He considered this. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility." "It is," she said, "but it is also a gift." They reached the edge of a reflecting pool and stopped. The water mirrored the stars so perfectly that it felt as if they were standing between two skies. "When I believed I was dying," Thyra said softly, "I thought often about what I would leave behind. Now I understand that what we leave behind is not always something we can see. Sometimes it is a path others will walk." Owen nodded. "And sometimes it's a bridge." She smiled. "Yes, a bridge." Far above them, a newly launched research vessel ignited its engines and began its slow ascent toward orbit, carrying a mixed crew of Karathi and humans to establish the first joint laboratory beyond their homeworld. Its light grew smaller as it climbed until it became just another moving star among many. They stood in silence, watching it disappear into the vastness. At last, Thera said, "Do you ever regret coming here?" Owen shook his head. "No. I came to study a problem. I found all of this." "That is often how the most important journeys begin," she said. The night deepened, and the garden grew quiet except for the soft sound of water and the distant hum of the city. Somewhere far beyond the atmosphere, the research vessel continued its voyage, carrying with it the promise of discoveries yet to be imagined. And on a world that had once prepared for morning, life moved forward, not unchanged, but stronger, wiser, and more connected than before, shaped by the simple, extraordinary realization that even the most impossible problems can yield when minds from different worlds dare to work together.